The dust in the Mexican courtyard was thick enough to taste. Second Lieutenant George S. Patton felt the air move as a bullet passed his ear. He raised his custom revolver, centered the sights on a charging horseman, and squeezed the trigger. Click. The silence was the most terrifying sound of the war. The man who would eventually lead armies across Europe was standing in the open with an empty weapon. His ivory-handled Colt was a masterpiece of steel and bone. But in that frantic moment, it was nothing more than an expensive paperweight. That mechanical failure in 1916 almost ended the career of a future legend. It also changed the way he armed himself for the next 30 years. The two revolvers on his hips were never for vanity. They were a violent insurance policy against the day his primary plan ran dry. Patton arrived at the border as a wealthy, ambitious officer with a massive history to live up to. He came from a long line of soldiers who had bled for America in every major conflict. His grandfather was a Confederate colonel who died leading a charge at the Battle of Winchester. Young George grew up hearing these war stories at the family dinner table in California. He felt the heavy weight of that heritage every single time he fastened his uniform buttons. But there was a deep contradiction that fueled his obsessive need to prove his worth. He struggled with severe dyslexia at a time when the condition was virtually unknown to educators. Reading and writing were not natural skills for him. They were a constant, grueling labor. He was forced to repeat his entire first year at West Point because he failed basic mathematics. To his peers, he often seemed like a man struggling just to keep his head above water. But inside, Patton was developing a mastery of the physical geometry of the battlefield. He found his brilliance in the movement of men, the weight of steel, and the speed of horses. He was a world-class athlete who competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics. He finished fifth overall, a feat that proved his physical endurance was unmatched. During the pistol event, he insisted his bullets pass through existing holes in the target. The judges disagreed, but Patton's confidence in his own marksmanship never wavered. He was also a master swordsman who designed a new cavalry saber for the United States Army. The M1913 Patton saber was a straight, thrusting blade meant for aggressive charges. He didn't just study history. He genuinely believed he had lived it in previous incarnations. He often told friends that he had served as a Roman legionnaire and a medieval knight. This wasn't just a quirk of his personality. It was the core of his warrior philosophy. He believed he was destined for greatness, provided he could find a fight to prove it. When the call came for the expedition into Mexico, he saw his chance to enter the arena. He didn't care about the heat, the dust, or the lack of official support for his presence. He wanted to be the tip of the spear in America's first modern, motorized military campaign. Before leaving, he visited the Colt factory to commission a weapon that reflected his status. He purchased a Colt single-action Army revolver in the powerful .45 long Colt caliber. He chose a 4 3/4-inch barrel for a faster draw from his hip holster. The weapon was finished with intricate engravings by the master craftsman Kuno Helfricht. But the most famous feature was the set of shimmering white ivory grips on the handle. He had his initials, GSP, carved into the ivory to mark it as his personal property. For a second lieutenant making only $155 a month, this was a massive investment. It was a tool of war, but it was also a talisman that connected him to the old frontier. He didn't know that this beautiful piece of machinery was about to fail him in the desert heat. He was heading into a territory where ghosts and revolutionaries held all the cards. The Mexican desert was a labyrinth of deep canyons and hidden adobe-walled ranches. The U.S. Army was still learning how to use trucks and airplanes in this unforgiving terrain. Patton was at the center of this technological shift, serving as Pershing's shadow. He was desperate for his first kill, a ritual he believed was necessary for any true leader. He spent his free hours practicing his quick draw and his offhand shooting in the sand. He wanted to be ready for the exact moment when the talking stopped and the shooting began. That moment was waiting for him at a quiet ranch called San Miguelito. It would be a fight that lasted less than 2 minutes, but echoed for 3 decades. The Ivory-Handled Colt was about to become the most famous handgun in the world. But first, it had to survive a reload while 3 men were trying to put a bullet in his brain. The era of the two-gun general was born in the dust of a fumbled cylinder. Patton was about to find himself at the center of a manhunt that felt like a relic of the Old West. By the spring of 1916, the American border was a zone of extreme tension and frequent violence. Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus had left the town in smoldering ruins and 18 Americans dead. The punitive expedition was a massive, sprawling effort to restore national honor and capture the rebel leader. General Pershing led 10,000 soldiers into the harsh, mountainous terrain of the Chihuahua Desert. The American forces were a strange mix of 19th century cavalry and 20th century technology. They brought thousands of horses, but they also brought Curtiss Jenny biplanes and Dodge touring cars. Patton found himself in the middle of this experimental military transition as Pershing's personal aide. His daily life was a blur of dust, logistics, and the endless pursuit of an enemy who didn't want to be found. The American troops found themselves chasing ghosts across a landscape that was hostile to outsiders. Villa had split his forces into small, highly mobile bands that knew every cave and canyon in the Sierra Madre. The villagers were often silent, either out of loyalty to Villa or fear of his legendary temper. Intelligence reports were often days old by the time they reached the American encampments. Pershing was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of a decisive engagement or a clear victory. The American newspapers began to mock the wild goose chase that was costing millions of dollars. Patton, however, was not discouraged by the heat or the lack of a clear front line to attack. He saw the desert as a testing ground for his theories on mechanized movement and aggressive scouting. He spent his time studying maps and interrogating the few informants who were willing to talk for money. In early May, a piece of high-value intelligence finally landed on the general's desk. Reliable sources indicated that Captain Julio Cardenas was operating in the vicinity of Rubio, Mexico. Cardenas was not a common bandit. He was the commander of Villa's personal bodyguard, the Dorados. He was effectively Villa's second in command and the most dangerous man in the region. Capturing or killing Cardenas would be the first major victory of the entire frustrating campaign. Patton pestered Pershing until he was finally given permission to join the search parties. He was assigned to a routine mission to purchase corn for the cavalry horses near the San Miguelito Ranch. It was a mundane logistics task, but Patton knew the ranch was owned by the Cardenas family. He viewed the corn mission as a perfect cover for a high-stakes, unauthorized military raid. He handpicked a small team of 10 soldiers and 2 civilian guides for the expedition. They traveled in 3 1915 Dodge Brothers Model 3035 touring cars, which were rugged and fast. These vehicles could reach speeds of 50 miles per hour on the flat desert floor. Patton sat in the lead car with his ivory-handled Colt 45 resting in a holster on his right hip. He had loaded the cylinder with only 5 rounds, leaving the hammer on an empty chamber for safety. This was standard practice for the time, but it meant he was entering a fight with one less shot than possible. The small convoy roared toward the San Miguelito Ranch, raising a massive plume of dust behind them. The ranch was a typical adobe structure with thick walls and a large central courtyard for livestock. Patton had studied the layout from previous reconnaissance missions and knew all the potential exits. He planned a coordinated strike that would block all 3 escape routes simultaneously using the car. One car would block the south wall, another would cover the east gate, and Patton would take the north. It was the first time the U.S. Army had ever attempted a synchronized motorized assault on a building. The soldiers were armed with bolt-action Springfield rifles, which were accurate but slow to fire in close quarters. Patton relied entirely on his revolver, a weapon he had practiced with until the draw was a reflex. He was gambling his entire career on the hunch that Cardenas was hiding inside those adobe walls. If he was wrong, he would be court-martialed for abandoning a logistics mission to play bounty hunter. If he was right, he would finally get the blood baptism he believed a great leader required. The car skidded to a halt near the ranch gates. the engine still growling and vibrating in the heat. Everything was silent for a few seconds as the dust settled over the courtyard. Then, the silence was shattered by the sound of shouting in Spanish and the frantic neighing of horses. The doors to the main house flew open, and 3 riders burst out at a full, desperate gallop. They were not surrendering. They were charging straight toward Patton's position with carbines drawn. The young lieutenant stood his ground, drew his ivory-handled Colt, and centered his sights. The mechanical failure he was about to experience would change his life forever. The desert was about to witness the birth of a legend and the death of a revolutionary. The air in the courtyard of San Miguelito was suddenly thick with the smell of horse sweat and dry adobe. The 3 horsemen did not hesitate when they saw the American vehicles blocking their path. They were in the Dorados, the elite golden bodyguards of Pancho Villa, and they were trained to die fighting. The lead rider was Captain Julio Cardenas, the man Patton had spent weeks hunting through the brush. He leaned low over his horse's neck, his reins in his teeth and a Winchester carbine in his hands. The riders were closing the distance at a terrifying speed, their hooves kicking up a blinding screen of sand. Patton stood alone near the north gate, his boots planted firmly in the Mexican soil. He was not behind the cover of his Dodge touring car. He was standing in the open like a frontier lawman. He drew the engraved Colt 45 from its holster with a motion he had practiced thousands of times. The ivory grip felt cool and solid in his palm, a stark contrast to the rising heat of the afternoon. The range was closing fast, 50 yards, then 40, then 30. At 20 yards, the riders opened fire with a ragged volley of carbine shots. Patton did not flinch as the lead bullets whistled past his head and thudded into the adobe walls behind him. He raised his revolver, took a breath, and centered the front sight on Cardenas's chest. He squeezed the trigger, and the heavy .45 caliber round boomed across the ranch courtyard. The bullet struck Cardenas in the arm, shattering the bone and nearly knocking him from his saddle. The horse reared in pain as Patton fired a second shot, this one hitting the animal in the neck. Horse and rider went down in a chaotic tangle of limbs and dust just feet away from Patton's position. The other 2 riders thundered past him, firing their carbines over their shoulders as they galloped toward the south wall. Patton ducked around the corner of the ranch house to find a momentary shield from the incoming fire. He needed to reload his single-action revolver, a task that required calm focus under extreme pressure. He opened the loading gate on the side of the Colt and began to eject the spent brass casings. In that moment, the mechanical reality of his weapon choice became a life-threatening liability. A single-action Army revolver is slow to reload because each cartridge must be handled individually. He had to rotate the cylinder, push the ejector rod, and then thumb a fresh round into each chamber. While his fingers fumbled with the cartridges, the surviving Dorados were circling back for another pass. 3 shots snapped past the corner of the house, one of them so close Patton felt the displacement of air. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he was standing in a gunfight with an empty weapon. The silence of his own gun was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard in his life. He finally snapped the loading gate shut, but the 2 minutes of reloading felt like 2 hours. He stepped back into the open just as the second rider leveled a carbine at his chest. Patton fired again, hitting the second horse and sending the rider rolling into the dirt. The American soldiers from the other 2 cars had now dismounted and joined the fray. The courtyard echoed with the sharp, rhythmic cracks of Springfield bolt-action rifles. The second rider tried to stand and reach for his pistol, but he was cut down by a volley of rifle fire. The third rider realized the escape was blocked and tried to make a break for the open desert to the west. He was nearly 100 yards away when the American riflemen found their range. A single .30-06 round struck him in the back, and he fell lifelessly from his horse into the scrub. Patton turned his attention back to the first rider, the wounded Captain Cardenas. The Mexican officer had crawled out from under his dead horse and was trying to reach a low wall. He was bleeding heavily from his arm, but still held a pistol in his good hand. One of Patton's civilian guides, a man named Holmdahl, ran forward to intercept him. Holmdahl shouted for Cardenas to surrender, but the revolutionary answered with a defiant shot. The bullet missed, and Holmdahl returned fire, putting a round through the captain's head. The gunfight was over as quickly as it had begun, leaving 3 dead men in the dirt. Patton stood over the body of Cardenas, his ivory-handled Colt still warm in his hand. He had achieved his first kill, but the victory was overshadowed by the memory of his fumbled reload. He looked at his beautiful engraved revolver and saw a flaw that could have ended his career. The weapon was a masterpiece, but it was a 6-shooter that only carried 5 rounds for safety. In a fight against multiple enemies, those 5 rounds were gone in the blink of an eye. He vowed that he would never again enter a combat zone without a backup plan for his firepower. The idea of the 2-gun general was no longer a matter of style. It was a tactical necessity. But before he could address his equipment, he had to deal with the 3 bodies in the courtyard. He ordered his men to lash the dead revolutionaries to the hoods of the Dodge touring cars. He wanted to bring the evidence of his victory directly back to General Pershing's headquarters. It was a grisly, theatrical gesture that reflected Patton's instinct for psychological warfare. He wanted every outpost they passed to see that the Dorados were not invincible. The convoy roared out of San Miguelito, the engine straining under the weight of the trophies. Patton sat in the front seat, his eyes fixed on the horizon, already planning his next move. He had survived the desert's ghosts, but the lessons of the empty chamber were just beginning. The world was about to meet a man who would never be caught with an empty gun again. But first, Patton had to process the visceral data of those 60 seconds in the San Miguelito courtyard. The adrenaline of the gunfight began to ebb, replaced by a cold, analytical dread in Patton's mind. He looked down at his right hand, which was still gripping the ivory handle of his Colt 45. The weapon felt heavier than it had moments before, a symbol of both his victory and his near death. He could still hear the whistling sound of the 3 bullets that had snapped past his skull while he fumbled. Those rounds had been fired by men who were technically inferior in training, but superior in volume of fire. They didn't have custom engravings or ivory grips. They had Winchester carbines that could fire 15 rounds without reloading. Patton realized that his devotion to the frontier style of the single-action revolver was a tactical vulnerability. The Colt single-action army was a weapon designed for a world that moved at the speed of a horse. In the new world of motorized cars and rapid-fire rifles, the slow manual reload was a death sentence. He replayed the moments he stepped behind the adobe wall to clear his empty brass casings. His fingers had been steady, but the mechanical process of the gun itself was inherently flawed. He had to open the gate, align the cylinder, and use the ejector rod for every single spent shell. Then he had to reach into his belt loops, pull out individual cartridges, and slide them into the chambers. If he had been facing 5 men instead of 3, he would have been killed before he could chamber a 3rd round. The silence of that empty chamber had been a louder lesson than the roar of his first shot. He began to think about the concept of firepower continuity before he even had a name for it. He understood that in combat, the most dangerous moment is the pause between your last shot and your next one. This realization started a mental shift that would define his entire philosophy of war. He would later apply this to his tanks and his infantry. Never let the enemy have a moment of silence. He wanted his units to maintain a reconnaissance by fire, constantly putting lead in the air to keep the enemy down. But on a personal level, he needed a mechanical solution that would prevent him from being a helpless spectator. He looked at the 3 bodies tied to the hoods of the Dodge touring cars and felt a grim satisfaction. He had proven his courage, but he also knew that he had been incredibly lucky that the Mexican riders were poor marksmen. The news of the raid reached General Pershing's headquarters before the dust from the cars even settled. The press was already calling Patton the bandit killer and a hero of the motorized cavalry. Pershing was delighted by the success and promoted Patton to first lieutenant on the spot. He gave Patton the nickname Bandito, a title the young officer wore with immense pride. But while the reporters were writing about his bravery, Patton was writing letters to his father about his guns. He explained that he had nearly gone to the great beyond because he ran out of ammunition. He told his family that he intended to find a way to make sure he always had a killing gun ready. The search for the second weapon was not about vanity or showing off to his fellow officers. It was an insurance policy written in steel and ivory against the failure of his primary tool. He began to research the latest development in handgun technology, looking for something with more power and speed. He was no longer interested in just carrying a beautiful revolver. He wanted a redundancy system. He understood that a warrior's image was important for morale, but his survival was important for the mission. The two ivory-handled revolvers that became his trademark were born from this specific moment of terror. He decided that if he ever went into a fight again, he would carry a second loaded weapon on his other hip. If the Colt ran dry, he wouldn't hide behind a wall to reload while bullets whistled over his head. He would simply draw the second gun and keep the pressure on the enemy until the threat was neutralized. This was the birth of the two-gun persona that would dominate future newsreels. It was a psychological weapon designed to project unstoppable overlapping force. The ivory grips were the bait, but the loaded cylinders were the message. The two-gun rig was a constant reminder to never be caught unprepared again. The lucky lieutenant was becoming a calculated architect of his own image, but it would take nearly 2 decades to find the perfect backup. Patton's transition to a two-gun setup was an act of tactical redundancy. He learned in 1916 that a fumbled reload was a window of extreme vulnerability. Mexico was only the beginning. When Patton deployed to France in 1917 to lead the newly formed Tank Corps, he carried the same ivory-handled Colt on his hip. Inside a cramped, oil-slicked Renault tank, a long rifle was useless, but a revolver could save his life in an ambush. Inside a cramped, oil-slicked Renault tank, a long rifle was a liability. A handgun was the only practical tool for defending a vehicle in close quarters. Patton wore his ivory Colt 45 as his primary sidearm throughout the campaign, but the memory of the empty chamber in Mexico haunted his every decision. He began experimenting with backup weapons to ensure firepower continuity. He realized a backup needed to be just as lethal as his primary gun. If one cylinder ran dry, the other hip provided 6 more chances to survive. In 1935, Smith & Wesson released the first .357 registered Magnum. It was the most powerful production handgun on the planet at that time. Patton ordered one immediately with a short barrel for maximum portability. He had the factory fit it with matching ivory grips to complete his rig. By 1941, he wore the old Colt on his right and the modern Magnum on his left. It was his philosophy in steel: respect the past, but carry the future's power. He understood that these guns were for leading an army by example. When he stood on a jeep, the sun glinted off the white ivory grips. They projected an image of a man who would never be caught unprepared. The two-gun setup was his silent promise that he had planned for every failure. He turned a moment of near death into a lifelong strategic advantage. The ivory grips were no longer decorations. They were the handles of a legend. The lucky lieutenant had finally become a global icon of martial readiness. The ivory grips on Patton's revolvers were the most recognizable part of his personal brand. In every photograph from the battlefields of Sicily to Germany, they stood out. The white bone contrasted sharply against the dark leather of his holsters. But the most famous thing about these grips was not their beauty. It was Patton's aggressive and vocal defense of them. During the war, a reporter once asked him about his pearl-handled revolvers. Patton's reaction was immediate and visceral. He corrected the journalist with a quote that is now legendary. He stated that only a pimp in a cheap New Orleans bordello would carry a pearl-handled pistol. This wasn't just a colorful insult designed to make a good headline. It was a statement of his professional standards and his knowledge of gear. Mother of pearl is a brittle, iridescent material harvested from shells. It is a terrible choice for a working combat weapon. Pearl is incredibly smooth and becomes dangerously slippery when coated in rain or sweat. In a gunfight, a pearl grip could cause the weapon to twist or fly out of the hand. It also shatters easily if dropped on a hard surface or struck by shrapnel. Patton viewed pearl as gaudy and superficial. Ivory was the traditional material of the ultimate professional warriors. It was the choice of the Texas Rangers and the frontier lawmen he admired. Ivory is a porous organic material that actually improves its grip as it wears. When a palm becomes sweaty during stress, Ivory develops a tacky texture. This ensures the revolver stays seated firmly in the shooter's hand for every shot. It is far more durable than shell and can absorb heavy recoil. Patton's grips were customized with his initials and his stars of rank. On his original Colt, he also kept the 3 notches he carved in Mexico. These were a grim reminder that he had already been tested by fire. The ivory also served a vital psychological purpose for his soldiers. Patton believed a general must be a visible hero to inspire confidence. The ivory grips were like the white plume on a medieval knight's helmet. They were a signal that old blood and guts was present on the front lines. When he toured the muddy foxholes, soldiers looked for that flash of white. It told them their commander was ready to use the tools of a gunman. He had taken a mechanical failure and turned it into a symbol of readiness. The ivory was his signature, the mark of a man who valued function over show. By 1935, Patton was a high-ranking officer interested in the cutting edge of ballistics. He was no longer satisfied with only the old power of the .45 Long Colt. That year, Smith & Wesson introduced the registered Magnum. This weapon chambered the .357 Magnum round, which redefined handgun lethality. The .357 Magnum generated a muzzle velocity of over 1,500 feet per second. This was nearly double the speed of the standard Colt .45 projectile. At the time, it was the most powerful production handgun in the world. Patton saw this weapon as a high-velocity backup system. He contacted the factory directly to order a customized version of this masterpiece. He requested a 3.5-inch barrel for maximum portability. This shorter length allowed for a faster draw from a staff car or a tank seat. The weapon featured a deep blue finish that looked like a dark mirror. True to his philosophy, he had the factory fitted with matching ivory grips. He had the initials GSP and his stars carved into the bone. This weapon became what he called his killing gun in his private journals. The Colt was for daily duties, but the .357 was for the worst-case scenario. If his primary weapon ran dry again, he wanted overwhelming power in his left hand. The .357 Magnum could punch through the car doors and light armor with ease. It was a modern insurance policy against the chaos of the Mexican desert. Patton began wearing both revolvers on his belt during the 1940s maneuvers. He wore the Colt on his right hip and the Smith & Wesson on his left. This meant he could reach a high-caliber weapon instantly with either hand. This overlapping field of fire gave him absolute mechanical security. He was the only Allied general who carried such massive personal firepower. Other commanders carried the standard semi-automatic pistol, but Patton despised the automatic because he believed it could jam in the mud. He trusted the simple rotation of a revolver cylinder more than any magazine. The .357 Magnum was a statement that he was always ready for a fight. He even used it to shoot at a German aircraft that strafed his headquarters. It was a gesture of defiance that became part of his growing legend. The revolvers were no longer just tools. They were psychological artillery. The sight of the 2 ivory grips gave his soldiers a focus for their own spirit. They believed their general was invincible because he carried the proof. The .357 Magnum ensured the fumbled reload of 1916 remained in the past. He was a man who moved with 2 histories and 2 hammers ready to fall. Patton understood the power of the image. A leader must be a lighthouse in the storm of battle. His polished helmet and shining revolvers were not for vanity. They projected an aura of absolute, unbreakable confidence. This image was born from a moment of deep vulnerability. A fumbled reload in Mexico while bullets whistled past. Patton learned that courage is nothing without preparation. He vowed never to be a helpless spectator again. The 2-gun rig was his manifesto on redundancy. He applied this logic to his armies and his maneuvers. He wanted a backup for every plan and every problem. The ivory grips became a permanent part of military history. They are now relics of a vanished era of warfare. The original Colt rests at the Fort Knox Museum. It reminds us of a time when a general was a gunman. Patton chose ivory because it was tough and functional. He rejected pearl as fragile and built for the wrong show. He wanted his men to see a warrior ready for blood. The revolvers promised he would stay in the fight. He never forgot the sound of an empty chamber. He turned that fear into a trademark for millions. Symbols are as powerful as the rounds they fire. The two-gun general remains a striking figure in history. His ivory grips are the handles of a legend. Like and subscribe for more hidden history. Comment below. What is your favorite Patton story? Thank you for watching.